Office of the Dean of the Graduate School, this is GradFUTURES, conversations exploring graduate student futures and all things professional development. I'm your host, Helen Wainaina, a new media fellow at the graduate school and a PhD student in the Department of English at Princeton. Today, I'll be speaking with SarahJanes Leslie, who is a doctorate graduate of Princeton and now the class of 1943 professor of philosophy. She has previously served as the Dean of the Graduate School, Vice Dean for Faculty Development, Director of the Program in Linguistics, and Founding Director of the Program in Cognitive Science at Princeton. Much of her work is focused on gender gaps in educational and career choices. Her finding that academic gender gaps are the most pronounced in disciplines that emphasize the need for raw brilliance was named one of 2015's most interesting scientific findings by Edge. She's affiliated faculty in the Department of Psychology and various other centers and programs. SarahJanes, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me as a guest, Helen. I'm delighted to be here.
I am so curious and interested, not only by your research, but also by your experience as a dean of the graduate school and the life that you have lived in this university as a champion of graduate student futures and professional development. So I was wondering if you could just introduce us to that time in your academic career.
Absolutely. So my history at Princeton actually starts 20 years ago when I came here as a graduate student myself. After receiving my PhD from the philosophy department, I was asked to join the faculty as an assistant professor, and I've been a faculty member in the philosophy department ever since. And as you correctly noted, I became the Dean of the Graduate School I was appointed in 2017, and I was honored to serve in that role for several years. I've recently stepped down and rejoined the faculty following the birth of my daughter, Olivia, so I'm delighted to have time, some more flexible time to spend with her. But one of my passions as dean and indeed as a faculty member has been professional development for graduate students, recognizing the imperative to prepare particularly PhD students to feel equipped and empowered to explore the entire range of career possibilities available to them. I think that too often doctoral education is seen as only of value in terms of training the next generation of professors, but actually it can be valuable in so many more ways than that. And opening up that full horizon to graduate students is something that has been a great passion of mine.
How did that begin for you? I mean, as a faculty member, when did you start to notice that graduate students maybe needed a variety of means to explore their professional futures?
I suppose probably the journey started way back when I was in graduate school myself. I would say that the atmosphere amongst the graduate students in my time was that really success equaled an academic job and anything else was a sort of unfortunate plan B. And I don't think I was especially critical of that when I was a graduate student myself, but then over the years with the perspective of a faculty member, seeing the sort of pain and despair that can cause in some cases, seeing that students really view the academic path as the only lit path in front of them and everything else is this sort of uncharted darkness, and realizing that it really doesn't have to be that way. There's often a lot of conversation around, when students are unable to get an academic job, how can we sort of mitigate this disaster that has befallen them, right? But actually, I mean, what a terribly ridiculous framing. Many people just may decide that academia is not fundamentally for them. It's not what they want to do. And academic life is a very particular kind of life. And frankly, there's a whole world out there. And someone with the skills to actually acquire a PhD is just going to be able to make wonderful contributions across an incredibly broad range. And we need students to feel empowered and happy to do this.
What did students need when you were, for example, when you were stepping into the role of dean of the graduate school? What were some of the practical, not just reframing, right? Not just a kind of broad, that we need to think about this differently, but what did they need? What were the gaps that were missing that you were observing as you were walking into that role?
I think probably the number one thing is giving students the opportunity to, first of all, explore, but also acquire the sorts of professional skills needed to make them employable in a broader market. Depending on the discipline, the academic work that one does may not be that immediately translatable to a practical field. And so, for example, giving students the opportunity to pursue internships, particularly, say, at nonprofits where there may not be funding available to them, but they can't be on their academic funding because they're not, for that period of time, acting as students. Well, that was a gap that it turned out was prohibiting a lot of students, especially in the humanities, from pursuing those sorts of opportunities. And that's just one very particular example, but indicative, I think, of a broader culture in which students didn't know how to bridge the gap from their academic world to that broader universe. Creating a centralized resource for graduate students to aid them in their professional development was one of the things that I most wanted to do coming in as dean. My predecessor, Sanj Kulkarni, had invested in this already, and it was Amy Pizolkowski on the graduate school staff who was doing tremendous work already. But my vision was to create something that was larger in scale, that had a broad range of offerings, and also served as a hub that would connect graduate students with other sorts of offerings around campus that would benefit them. So really the vision of GradFUTURES is for there to be a place, an entry point for graduate students who want to develop their professional skills, whether that be with an eye to seeking a broad range of career possibilities, or just even developing the sorts of skills that will make one a better academic. The drive behind the vision for GradFUTURES was to move away from the dichotomy between thinking of academic work as one thing and the professional realm, the non-academic realm, as another, and recognize that actually the two can go hand in hand, that one can be a better academic for developing professional skills, while at the same time recognizing that having well-developed professional skills is going to set one up to be able to be competitive in the broadest range of career possibilities that one wants to pursue. I think it's very important that this be a centralized resource, and I know there's sometimes disagreement over this, but realistically, individual academic departments, of which there are 42 on campus, right, they're not going to be able to individually replicate that sort of resource. Just even efficiency of scale aside, faculty are typically some of the least well-placed people to advise students on a broader range of career possibilities, right? Many faculty, like myself, have spent their whole careers in academia, and we don't have that kind of skill set. But there are people who specialize in exactly this. Again, Eva Gubu and her team being exactly paradigmatic examples of this. And so the vision was to create a centralized resource that graduate students could go to, and not per se directly because they're thinking, okay, I have now decided that I'm not going to pursue an academic career. What else am I going to do? But rather seeing professional development as something that goes hand in hand with academic development from day one, recognizing that there are skills that one can acquire that are going to be helpful in an academic career, but also, helpful in other areas too, if that's what one decides to do. So really integrating the two together, having that start from day one for graduate students and having it be available to them centrally to all students in the graduate school, regardless of department.
And this might be maybe a profoundly complicated question, but I was very interested in the work that you have done looking at this idea around raw brilliance and its relationship to academic disciplines, or the gender gap in certain academic disciplines. I'm wondering if that's something that has connected to how you see or how you think about professional trajectories for graduate students, or even how you advise graduate students now in your department.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's particularly if one is in a discipline, and maybe I should just back up and say what my collaborators and I have found across a variety of contexts is that first of all, individual departments differ in the extent to which the practitioners believe that a certain kind of raw, unteachable, innate brilliance is required to succeed, versus really thinking that success is largely a matter of hard work, skill development, really putting in the time to develop those skills. Furthermore, there are ambient stereotypes out there, and we've actually found, sadly, that little girls as young as 6 absorb these stereotypes that link that kind of raw brilliance to men more so than to women. And so the combination of this messaging in certain disciplines with these widely available social stereotypes, we have found to lead to certain academic disciplines, the ones that prize that kind of raw brilliance, on average seeing greater gender gaps than ones that, in comparison with ones that emphasize that less. So, I think that is something for practitioners of disciplines that have those sorts of brilliance beliefs. And, I'm a philosopher, and there's one discipline that even more so than, say, computer science, physics, mathematics, the discipline that placed the greatest emphasis in our study on the need for raw brilliance actually was philosophy. So it was sort of one of the things that inspired the project in the first place. So, I do think that in advising graduate students, being aware of how these messages, which in and of themselves may not be in any way intended to have any kind of gendered influence, nonetheless will interact with these stereotypes that people have previously internalized, and that can absolutely impact the extent to which a person feels a sense of belonging, self-efficacy, et cetera, in a field.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose the other connection to me, at least in this conversation, has to do with access, diversity, and inclusion, or equity, diversity, and inclusion. In the description that you gave for raw brilliance, you're describing that this framing creates a serious gender gap in PhD or doctorate fields. Your findings also suggest that this happens when we consider race. And so in the work that we're doing to make graduate education more accessible for underrepresented groups, there seems to be a need to also create equitable pathways for diverse career expressions for underrepresented groups. So I'm really interested in the intersection between Graduate Futures and the initiatives of something like access, diversity, and inclusion?
Absolutely. I think that there are really two things that I did as dean that I'm especially proud of. The first was hiring Eva Kubu to lead the Grad Futures initiative, and the second was hiring Renita Miller to lead the Access, Diversity, and Inclusion team. And both have made absolutely spectacular progress, and I'm so excited to see where the future will take them. But I think that you're pointing to something absolutely critical. I think that as you open up access to higher education to people who have historically been underrepresented, I think one of the things that you have to recognize is there can be soft skills, if you like, unspoken norms that may be known amongst people whose backgrounds are more closely connected with the norms of higher education, but which won't be known and won't be shared by people who have been historically underrepresented. Subtleties, things to navigate, what's expected of one in a particular situation. These are things which, if left unsaid, can create and perpetuate inequalities. And so I think the sort of thing that both Grad Futures and also the Access, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative can achieve is leveling the playing field by teaching these sorts of things explicitly, by recognizing that this is a body of professional knowledge that a person, regardless of background, can easily learn, but it has to be made available to them as something that they can learn. And I actually do think that connects interestingly back to the notion of raw brilliance, which again is inherently a notion that you don't really need to be taught. You don't really need to develop those skills. You just naturally have the brilliance to excel in your field. A contrary and I think more realistic view is that actually any kind of academic success involves learning a whole host of skills, putting in time, effort, dedication, building up those skills. And critically, these are skills that can be taught, but we have to give people the opportunity to learn them.
Yes. I like the sort of emphasis and emphatic conviction of that statement. Can you say more about that? Why, and how can we more forcefully bring that to the forefront and not so much something that happens later on as you get further and further into your graduate education?
That's a great question. And, here I think actually there's a fair amount of onus on graduate students. I think that, there's a lot obviously that I try to do and that others are continuing to do as administrators. I think there are many faculty who are supportive and encouraging of this, but I think the number one thing is for graduate students to listen to this, to hear that these opportunities are available, and to embrace those opportunities. I think that there's sometimes a feeling amongst graduate students, totally understandably, but a feeling amongst graduate students that they should only do what their faculty advisors say tell them to do, or what other students who are more advanced in the program tell them to do. What Grad Futures, the entire purpose of it is to make this a resource available to any students at any point in their graduate careers who want to avail themselves of it. And the doors are wide open to any graduate student from day one. And the more that graduate students, particularly in a given department, start to do that, then the more that the next wave of graduate students, the ones who start the year after them, will also feel inspired and empowered to embrace these opportunities. So I think that actually in terms of really integrating it into the culture, that graduate students actually should feel and recognize that they have the power to also shape that culture around them by embracing these opportunities.
What do you say to, I suppose, the graduate student who has an advisor who is very much, or even maybe explicitly, won't take them seriously if they are exploring other ways to share their research or other ways to engage with the world with the skills that they're gaining as a graduate student?
I think that if a graduate student really has an advisor who is actively hostile to that, I think that that's a conversation that the with supportive deans in the graduate school to figure out how to navigate that. But my experience is that that is actually a very rare situation. And what is actually much more common is the following kind of communicative chasm. You have on the one side a graduate student who assumes that the faculty member will not support them in broadening their professional development skills. And you have a faculty member who would absolutely be supportive, but who's anxious that if they suggest that to the graduate student will hear that as a vote of no confidence in their academic work. And so you have this kind of standoff where, you know, as dean, I would speak to grad students, I would speak to faculty. Time and again, I heard this, that there's just this sort of chasm that is not being bridged. So I think it's actually, and I'm not saying that it never happens, but I think that it's much rarer than a certain sort of mythology suggests that a faculty member is actually openly hostile to that. And I think that often bringing this up, it just, you know, the graduate student taking the first step, if the faculty member isn't, though I would certainly encourage the faculty member to take that first step since it's often easier that way. But, you know, the graduate student can absolutely raise that. I would also add again that, you know, the Grad Futures initiative was really crafted not as this, not as the sort of other side of an academic, non-academic dichotomy, but rather, again, really to help students develop skills that are going to be helpful to them also in their academic development. Presentation skills, public speaking, writing skills, those sorts of things are all things that are absolutely essential to one's academic development, just as much as anything else. So I would also just push back against the idea that engaging with Grad Futures is sort of signing on for, you know, jumping from the academic camp, quote unquote, to the non-academic camp. I think we just need to get rid of that kind of dichotomy in our thinking.
Well, it's interesting that the way you were describing the standoff. I think something that I have encountered, or something that perplexes me, is the creation of these two camps, as if being a teacher or a professor is not a professional endeavor, when in fact it is. And our faculty are involved in a number of professional, maybe not necessarily like in the same vein as a corporate office or as a nonprofit endeavor, right? But teaching is in fact a profession. Being a scholar is in fact a profession, and there's a way to have a conversation around developing your persona, not only as a teacher in the classroom, but also as an employee of an institution, a university.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I think there are more professional aspects, as you're correctly pointing out, to academic work than is necessarily always recognized or talked about. I was listening to a lecture on YouTube the other day by a professor by the name of Richard McElraith at the Max Planck Institute, and he was making the case for the need, particularly in the sciences, for much more structure and thought around data stewardship and the sorts of ways that the, say the code involved in analyzing that data, et cetera, that actually the scientific community could learn a lot from the software development community in terms of best practices. I thought it was an absolutely fascinating talk, and just an example that came to my mind in terms of how, there's absolutely not this dichotomy. There's a spectrum.
SarahJane, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wow, thank you so much, Helen, for that incredible conversation with former Dean of the Graduate School, SarahJane Leslie. I'm Eva Kubu, and I'm here with my colleague, Associate Dean Renita Miller, who I've invited to join me today to further reflect on the role of professional development in ensuring equitable access to opportunity for all graduate students. Welcome to the Grad Futures podcast, Dean Miller.
Why, thank you, Dean Kubu. I am so excited to be here. It is my pleasure to be able to talk with you about our efforts and the ways in which we collaborate for your audience.
Well, thank you again for joining us. Can you give our audience a little bit of a framing around the priorities for access, diversity, and inclusion, and all of the efforts that you and your team are leading?
Absolutely. Thank you. So for us, it really is important to what I like to call create a community of belonging. And so we really take a to and through approach to diversity and inclusion, in that we've created a cadre of signature programs that really support students from the prospective student stage through their sort of term and tenure as graduate students. We also even support postdocs from time to time around various topics and various initiatives, because they also can benefit from a lot of the work that we're doing. We also like to think that we are also supporting the broader sort of pipeline to graduate school through a lot of our programs, like the P3 program, which is a visiting students program. We have the Grad Scholars program. We have the pre-doctoral fellowship program. We have our Diversity Fellows program. And most recently, we have the Inclusive Academy Symposium and the Best of Access, Diversity, and Inclusion Awards. We have a significant number of programs that support students as they are deciding on the graduate admissions process, all the way through their tenure as graduate students.
Wonderful. So it's really like the full life cycle, and really thinking about ways that you can demystify the graduate application process, encourage students to apply and to see themselves at Princeton and at other graduate institutions around the country. Is that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you could join the team, Eva. I think you captured it beautifully. And yes, absolutely. We're really thinking holistically about graduate admissions. And so it's really amazing to see students move through some of our programs. We have some students that participated in P3 that are now diversity fellows. So it's just a wonderful sort of opportunity and pipeline that we've created through all of the programs that we administer and focus on and support.
The Inclusive Academy Symposium really, I think, opened up a world of possibilities, new ways of thinking and celebrating our graduate student community. Can you share a little bit more about that event?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I would say the Inclusive Academy Symposium, it really was something quite special. And it was special because it was an opportunity for us to bring our graduate student and postdoctoral community together to discuss, critical topics that centered around thriving and joy and success. As we think about joy, and we think about oftentimes the other conversations that are centered around underrepresented groups, it is from this deficit model, from an area of lack, from an area of trauma, and not to dismiss those things in any way, and not to dismiss the inequality that exists and the challenges that people from underrepresented backgrounds face. It is just wanting to take a different approach in our symposium to focus on the joy, to focus on the genius and the brilliance. And so I feel like the symposium really embodied that in such a special way. And when we talk about unearthing, to unearth means to uncover, to show something that is hidden. And so we brought all of that together to celebrate, to unearth, to unhide genius and joy. And so we are all very proud of what we were able to accomplish as part of the symposium. We hope that people will join us next year. We've already set the dates, May 18th and 19th, 2023, to join us. We don't have a theme yet, but we are working on it. And I am hopeful that the celebration of these two themes will continue to pervade the work that we do, and continue to support and allow our community to feel seen, to feel valued, to feel heard. That was the purpose of it, and I really do feel like we were all able to accomplish that.
I think we've touched on the future of graduate education. We've touched on the future of work in this broad-ranging conversation. Again, Dean Miller, thank you so much for joining me and for all of the collaborations that we have embarked on together and those yet to come. I thank you. And thank you again to our executive producer, Helen Juanina, and to former Dean of the Graduate School, SarahJane Leslie, for this interview and this opportunity to join us at the Grad Futures podcast. Our episode 3 will be announced soon, and I will leave it to Helen to take it from here. Thank you again.
Thank you.
The Graduate Futures podcast is hosted and executive produced by me, Helen Juanina, editing and audio engineering by Francine Henry. For more about Graduate Futures and the podcast, visit graduatefutures.princeton.edu. Thank you for listening. Till next time.